Uh, Pathological / extreme demand avoidance. How do you build a demand avoidance disorder by Richard Woods, London South Bank University PhD student. So yeah, a bit about me. So I am autistic. I do meet one of the PDA behaviour profiles in print, which I specifically say nuisance because the different profiles have different traits and different wordings, and they have different kind of meanings due to that. I'm not emotionally attached to kind of meeting the PDA profile at all. I actually kind of reflect on how my values shape my understandings and construction of autistic people and PDA itself, which this video is kind of a bit about. Um, my agenda is for at least inclusive, good quality scientific method-based research and practice for autistic people generally. This is my interpretation of kind of literature. Others may disagree. Just putting that out there. So I do have some conflicts of interest. So I'm developing various PDA tools. So like for example the pathological demand avoidance belief scale, and I do earn some income from delivering training sessions on autism and PDA. So yeah, I reluctantly advocate for PDA to be diagnosed as a standalone diagnostic entity, which is video's kind of partly, well, as mainly what it's about. So yeah, it's a bit about the introduction of what this video will be covering. It'll be covering kind of mental disorders as social constructs, characteristics of mental disorders, and briefly covering kind of stress and demand avoidance, formulation using kind of clinical practice, interaction of current disorders, what PDA should look like as a disorder. So um, for this kind of scenario, I'm just referring to demand avoidance disorder as this kind of mythical disorder that PDA should look like. Obviously, then just building a demand avoidance disorder based on what it should look like, and then just reflecting on that. Um, so, first point is why should we build a demand avoidance disorder? Well, the first point is that we kind of can do as a theoretical exercise. So, all mental disorders as presented within the DSM-5, which is one of the main diagnostic manuals. It's the American one, by the American Psychiatric Association. They're all social constructs, so they all lack biomarker evidence. So because they're because of the basic social constructs, they can be kind of created out for now, and consequently they all have some kind of political element to them. One could argue there's quite a big political element to how PDA is constructed as a kind of form of autism and stuff. Um, yeah, so I've already kind of mentioned that, but so it's a good idea if one wants to get PDA accepted within the diagnostic manuals, it's a good idea to consider what it should look like what are the diagnostic manuals after, like what are they, like what are the kind of constructs within them actually looking like. So it gives an idea of how to um it gives an idea of how to construct PDA to kind of help it along to kind of if you want to get accepted kind of within the DSM-5 and kind of more broader clinically. So it also allows us to kind of inform how we conceptualize and model PDA. It allows us to inform how we design research studies and how to interpret research results. And it kind of matters because um, it matters because it looks like there's confirmation bias going on within certain PDA research studies interpretations. So yeah, going on to the first point. So this is a quote from Roger Pickle's 2016, which kind of talks about issues within validity within psychology-based research. So I'm just going to read it out. So as Kapoor et al. Puts it, the diagnostic systems were not designed to facilitate biological differences, and they do not. But equally, the biological studies have not so far led to a clinically viable alternative. Similarly, Hyman described diagnostic categories as transient useful fictions. Kendler, who chaired the scientific review committees for the DSM-5, broadly agreed, but made two additional points. He stated that no major biological breakthrough should be expected. Rather, a modest step-by-step approach should be followed. Second, the way the DSM criteria are used in practice creates major verification problems. Criteria may be useful to index disorders, but they should not be viewed as a direct measure of them. So as I said earlier, they kind of just made out of thin air, or they can be. And actually, like if you go look into the history of how the sorts of DSM have been kind of constructed and how some have entered the diagnostic manual, especially since DSM-3, the stuff that's included in DSM-3, like the disorders and categories there, were done by panel, by this panel voting. So yeah, and that's not scientific at all. Just a bit more about it. So this is a quote by Phil Christie that he tends to use in his conference talks. So both the ICD and DSM focus more on the reliability than the validity of the disorders they describe. It goes on to no iteration of either DSM or the ICD has acknowledged the fundamental distinction between researchers and practitioners and who uses diagnostic classifications and for what purpose. That's just focusing on how the features that are described in disorders and when they're assessed by clinicians or researchers, they're focused more on reliability of the feature that's being assessed and the validity of the feature and of the construct itself that's been attributed towards. What all that means is it doesn't matter if the feature you're measuring is complete nonsense, as long as you can get a consistent measure from it and across multiple clinicians, it can be used to construct a disorder. And I keep going back to this point. You can literally make them out of thin air and diagnostic groupings, and I'll use an example. So this is a diagram from Elizabeth Newton. It's from the first kind of work on PDA. So yeah, this is her diagnostic grouping she used to put PDA in. So you can see like PDA is put here. And this diagnostic grouping was made in 1986. It's important because it's 2 years before she created PDA's behaviour profile. And this is why she kind of says questions if PDA has a failure to kind of code social identity and therefore social obligation. And it matters because she made this out of thin air. So this is literally, she's called it pervasive developmental coding disorder. So so these 4 clusters of here are symptoms basically, and represent the more dense the dots are kind of clustering together, the more severe the kind of features are being expressed as symptoms. So you've got PDA in top right, you've got dyslexia down the bottom right, dysphagia, which is also known as asphagia in the bottom left, and then you've got autism spectrum, which also includes Asperger's syndrome. But she views autism and Asperger's to be a similar thing, but they kind of differentiate by IQ, which is nonsense. But you can see that like down here you got the bar for potential. So yeah, this is not something that's widely used in diagnostic practice at the time. Certainly isn't anymore. So what Newton did is she evolved this diagnostic grouping later, and she kind of just renamed it to pervasive developmental disorders. So what she did, she just literally dropped the coding term. And coding is when a person has issues either understanding or processing aspects of communication. So it explains why like PDA is meant to have issues with coding social identity, and autism is meant to have like recognized body language and other bits and pieces. And dysphagia or asphagia, it's more commonly known. It's failure to kind of code spoken languages, and dyslexia is failure to code kind of written languages. So so what she did is later on in her 2003 article, she has kind of collapsed asphagia and dyslexia together into specific language impairment, and she's kind of brought out Asperger's from autism, so they're still overlapping in the same kind of autism spectrum. And she's also kind of helped to explain what kind of how she views autism and Asperger's and PDA kind of clinically. So she's got like PDA kind of traits here, and the triad impairment, which the autism spectrum is based on. It's worth noting that Newton did not view PDA to be part of the autism spectrum, and it's why I say here that PDA, that Newton's diagram is problematic and fits it into kind of accepted practice. And I'll kind of go into that a bit next. So this is a simplified diagram of Newton's diagnostic grouping. So it's literally just a kind of the 5 constructs together. Newton views pervasive mental disorders not otherwise specified to be anyone who doesn't meet kind of threshold for either Asperger's or autistic disorder, specific language impairments, or PDA. So it's much more broader and includes non-autistic people. If you go onto here, this is what was accepted to be the autism spectrum as viewed by the DSM-4, which is used from 1994 onwards. So you have Asperger's, autistic disorder, pervasive mental disorder not otherwise specified, or PD-NOS is tucked in along with the autism spectrum, and you have Rett's disorder or Rett syndrome by itself, along with childhood disintegrative disorder. This is obviously not the same as Newton's diagnostic grouping it. So yeah, so let's use this to kind of show that you can kind of create diagnostic groupings and therefore disorders out of thin air and do what you like with them. So I'm going to move on to what's required to be a disorder, like what's the definition for them. So DSM-5 gives us a definition. This definition is slightly different from the DSM-4 one, but I'm going off on a tangent. So to read this out, a mental disorder is a syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotional regulation, or behavior that reflects dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying mental functioning. Mental disorders are usually associated with significant distress or disability in social, occupational, or other important activities, and an expectable or cultural approved response to a common stress or a loss, such as death of a loved one, is not a mental disorder. Socially deviant behaviour, e.g., political, religious, or sexual, and conflicts that are primarily between individual anxiety are not mental disorders unless the deviance or conflict results in dysfunction in the individual, as described above. So basically, any kind of category that we would like to have included within a DSM-5 should meet this definition. It's a much more vague one. So the DSM-5 actually has 4 residual categories for if anyone does not meet criteria or threshold for any of the hundreds of other kind of disorders or categories specified within the DSM-5, which is quite an achievement if it happens. But yeah, so this is just other specialized mental disorder, and it's quite brief. It's only a paragraph, so I'm going to read it out. So this category applies to presentations in which symptoms characteristics of a mental disorder that cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning predominate but do not meet the full criteria for any specific mental disorder. The other specified mental disorder category is used in situations in which the clinician chooses to communicate a specific reason that the presentation does not meet the criteria for any specific mental disorder. This is done by recording the other specified mental disorder followed by a specific reason. There is like an unspecified mental disorder category which is used when you don't want to specify how it doesn't meet it. But it's quite important. So you would notice this. The symptoms cause either clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. That's important because they're all terms, not and. So, yeah. So this DSM-5 is quite clear about limitations around mental disorders and problems with current kind of clinical classification, mainly in the front of the book, but also kind of later on when it kind of talks about kind of cross-categorical tools. So, yeah, limitations of a categorical approach to diagnosis include a failure to find zones of rarity between diagnoses, in brackets, i.e. delineation of mental disorders from one another by natural boundaries, close brackets, the need for intermediate categories like schizoaffective disorder, high rates of comorbidity, frequent not otherwise specified diagnoses, a relative lack of utility in further identification of unique antecedent validators for most disorders, and a lack of treatment specificity for various diagnostic categories. So this is saying quite a lot in here. So down here it's basically saying that many disorders, strategies or treatments for them or interventions used for them are not specific to it. So they basically are quite commonly used across many other disorders or kind of categories within the DSM-5. It also tells us that basically disorders are heterogeneous and they heterogeneous kind of continuums in the features that they present and how they present within people. But it also tells us that many features within the DSM within the kind of disorders or categories within the DSM-5 kind of overlap. That many features within them are seen in other categories and other disorders. So I've seen some research which suggests there's only about 57 specific symptoms within the kind of DSM. So yeah, another point is this use of not otherwise specified categories. So one issue with a dimensional approach is, the categorical approach is that many difficulties that people can present with may not be covered within a particular diagnosis. So is also people generally have spiky profiles. Even it just happens to be with autistic people tend to present even more spiky compared to other people. But the point with spiky profiles is, more generally, it's very difficult for people to fit within boxes that are used within kind of categorical approach. Subsequently, you need, in order to kind of help fit people within these kind of within boxes, you need to have kind of not over specified categories or kind of residual category to kind of mop up or kind of collect people who don't fit into the other categories or other kind of boxes that are used within the DSM-5. So yeah, this is what I'm going to talk about here. So what does a modern disorder look like? So they're heterogeneous in nature with porous boundaries. Most have features overlapping with other disorders and are a kind of continuum in nature. So many disorders may have conflicting evidence for which groupings they belong. So, for example, ADHD has some evidence which suggests it should be fit into disruptive impulse control and conduct disorders diagnostic grouping. So that's diagnostic grouping, which contains oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder, instead of being in neurodevelopmental disorders, which is where autism is and ADHD are. So DSM-5 also states it's no longer sensible to strive for homogeneous subtypes within disorders. And due to problems working out when a feature becomes kind of pathological, most disorders will have some phrase based on this phrase here. So the disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. And that those are or terms, are not ands. Let's go back earlier to other specified mental disorder. You can quite clearly see this phrase kind of based here. And again, if you go back to the disorder definition, you can again see it in here. So it causes usually associated with stress or disability in social, occupational, or other important areas of function or activity. So yeah, it's quite a key thing to look out for. So moving on. So what this table shows us is different PDA thresholds based relative to diagnostic thresholds for certain kind of disorders within the DSM-5. So what I've used here is the oppositional defiant disorder specifiers. So this is like mild features are only is when features are only shown in one setting, moderates when they're seen in at least two settings, and severe is when they're seen in three or more settings. So with ADHD, someone meets threshold for that when the features are expressed in these two settings. With autism, it has to be within these three, and just with these three, autism is meant to be from early infancy, but there's a couple of exclusion terms, which means it doesn't have to be expressed until later on in life. So this is obsessive compulsive disorder. So this is features must be time consuming, taking at least 1 hour per day, but this is it only needs to be seen within one setting. This is oppositional defiant disorder. Again, only needs to be seen in one sitting. And this is interesting. So it can be when it causes distress to people surrounding the person expressing the behaviours. So that itself is quite interesting. I'm going to ignore those, but it's just it's relevant so for later. So yeah, moving on to kind of stress and transactional stress. So stress is basically transactional environments. A person becomes stressed when the demands placed on them exceeds the resource of our coping mechanism. So a person finds the situation taxing. So the way in which to reduce on the stress levels is to improve their coping mechanisms. So if our coping mechanisms are more efficient, it allows us to deal with greater demands placed on us by stressors and stuff. So yeah, it's important to note that about 2/3 of distress behaviour are triggered by demands or requests by other people. It's also important to note that a recent systematic review has shown that there are increased emotional stress levels in autistic people, and that generally there's a need for autistic people to have stress management strategies used with them. Moving on to demand avoidance features. Demand avoidance is transactional. And that PDA itself is transactional with the environment that can be either internal or external to the individual. Also, modern autism understandings take a transactional stress approach to demand avoidance. So what this means is that they're not due to deficits located in an individual. And this is a quote. So below this is a quote from the DSM-5 autism criteria for particular criteria C. So symptoms must be present in the early development period, but may not become fully manifest until social demands exceed limited capabilities or may be masked by learning strategies later in life. So this is literally a transactional stress-based definition. So literally demands placed upon a person exceed their limited coping mechanisms, and therefore kind of like RBIs, that's restrictive, repetitive behaviour and interests, start being shown in such situations. So what this quote is mainly there to so an autistic person masks from early, from when they're young, so they're basically acting on autistic, and this is kind of important down here. So the DSM-5 contains tools to measure features that are basically cross-categorical, that are seen across many kind of disorders. And so I'm just taking an item from one of these tools, which is the cross-cutting symptom measure for adults. This is a self-report tool. So, and this is like the item is just avoiding situations that make you anxious. So, it's when a person avoids a situation that they find demanding. So basically, this is just showing that demand avoidance is quite common, and seen throughout the kind of human population. So moving on to formulation. Formulation is important, and we're going to get onto that in a moment. So yeah, a dimensional approach depending on primarily on an individual's subjective reports of symptom experiences, along with the clinician's interpretation, is consistent with current diagnostic practice. So this is a quote taken from DSM-5 in a section that it talks about cross-categorical kind of tools. So yeah, so part of the formulation, the clinician and the service user kind of work together as a kind of collaboration, and formulation is itself is a living document, so it can be updated as kind of like treatment kind of progresses, or not. So yeah, so the key difficulties are kind of documented. Psychological theories are used to kind of hypothesize how these difficulties are kind of developed and maintained, and there should be the formulation should be accounting of biological, sociological, circumstantial, or kind of life events, factors that kind of alter psychological processes to kind of affect psychological health. So there should be suggestions on how these difficulties are kind of related towards each other, and basically these should be used to plan kind of strategies and interventions that are used with an individual. And these are important because the formulation process is used quite widely in kind of clinical practice with psychologists and other kind of professionals. And I mention this because it's important because formulation is required to be used by practice psychologists by the Healthcare Professions Council, which is the regulator for practicing psychologists. So yeah, it's important to have a way in which can have a kind of models that can be used as part of the formulation process for the development and maintenance of the kind of PDA's kind of features and traits. So moving on, so one of the issues with a category approach, as mentioned earlier, is that many people will have more than one disorder-based diagnosis. So a person will often have co-occurring disorders or difficulties. So when they do, these kind of co-occurring categories disorders can interact with each other in an unpredictable manner. And so these interactions can cause some features to present more intense than they would by themselves, or present in less intensity, so be less severe or more severe in an unpredictable manner. At the same time, you can kind of have these unpredictable interactions can create new presentations, new kind of phenotypes, and the kind of difficulties from these interactions can be the kind of new presented phenotype or disorder can be more severe than the original categories by themselves. So yeah, we also know that autism often interacts with co-occurring conditions. You kind of get onto it. So This is a quote talking about autism and ADHD, and I'm going to mention it because it kind of talks about how some features in autistic people with ADHD are more severe than if ADHD or autism is seen by itself in people. So, yeah, it is widely reported that individuals with autism, ADHD, and coexistent autism and ADHD may experience difficulties with executive functioning, which may include difficulties in developing skills such as flexible thinking, self-monitoring, planning, working memory, self-control, organizational skills, and self-management. Difficulties in these areas can prove to be more severe in individuals with co-occurring autism ADHD compared to those with either condition alone, and the impacts may vary depending upon changing demands presented in the environment. Last bit's kind of interesting when you can think about kind of demand avoidance and PDA. So what this means is co-occurring difficulties can often be said differently in autistic persons versus non-autistic persons. PDA may be the result of unpredictable interactions between competing co-occurrence conditions and maybe a new disorder. So what this means is that a demand avoidance disorder should present slightly differently inside autistic persons versus non-autistic persons. Any such differences would mean that demand avoidance disorder does not mean autism is what I'm trying to say. I missed out on not there, so yeah, that's my fault. But yeah, it definitely means I'm trying to say it does not mean that it's a specific autism subgroup. Yeah, I missed out on no there, and a not. It should be quite clear. So this is what this diagram shows. So this diagram shows so this bit here is PDA. So it represents the kind of interaction between these accepted kind of conditions or categories interacting to kind of reduce PDA, and this kind of shows kind of characteristic overlap. So you've got autism at the top, anxiety, developmental trauma or trauma, oppositional defiance disorder, conduct disorder down here, and ADHD here, and kind of shows kind of PDA spiky profile. And so these kind of categories can interact atypically with each other, and they can produce kind of PDA. So these are PDA kind of features and traits here. So you've got like atypical social interactions, hyperactivity, social motivated behaviours, conduct problems, anxiety, obsessive kind of behaviour, demand, avoidance, fantasy, and role playing. And here you've got autism down here. So as used by DSM-5, so social communicative issues, restrictive repetitive behaviour, interests, insistence, same sensory issues. So yeah. What does all this mean for a demand avoidance disorder? Like, what should it look like? So, demand avoidance features are a continuum among human people. They're not specific to autistic persons. Demand avoidance disorder is a heterogeneous continuum. Its features overlap in many other kind of categories. Demand avoidance is transactional in nature, hence can be developed and maintained throughout lifespan. So, I'll get onto that a bit later. So, demand avoidance literally becomes pathologized once the disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in either social, occupational, or important areas of functioning. So, yeah, I would suggest that the features need to be expressed consistently in one or more settings for at least 12 months. It means that demand avoidance can be pervasive, but does not mean it intrinsically is pervasive. And likewise, demand avoidance can be from ADHD, but does not mean that demand avoidance disorder is intrinsically developmental in nature. And you can argue 12 months is arbitrary, and I would say yes, but I've chosen 12 months because it means it equates to the disability definition used by the UK government for the Equality Act. So if you're using this threshold for when demand avoidance is pathologised as part of a disorder, it should mean that a person's covered by disability legislation in the UK, and I'm particularly referring to the Equality Act. As mentioned earlier, demand avoidance disorder should present slightly differently in autistic persons versus non-autistic persons. We need to have theories for how the features are developed and maintained. It also means that the strategy of interventions will overlap with approaches used with other kind of categories of disorders, but it means that we've got quite a broad spectrum. Well, we have a broad heterogeneous kind of continuum based construct. So we can use these 5 traits, which and the universal kind of if the universal within this population as based from statistics from Nielsen. So avoidance of everyday demands is a yes, comfortable role playing pretense, no. Consistent mood swings and impulsivity, again, not universal. And frequent intense actions, kind of yes. Social avoidance behaviours, kind of no. Um, so this is kind of showing how the social avoidance features are kind of triggered by kind of demands, and basically how kind of extreme they are. So like the higher up here, the more kind of extreme, and I am putting that in quotation marks. What I'm trying to say is like the higher the features, the behaviours shown up here tend to be more difficult for people expressing them to actually kind of experience and kind of regulate and deal with. But it's also tends to be more difficult for those around the person expressing them to kind of deal with and kind of co-regulate. So what tends to happen is the more stressed the person is, the more likely they are to show these kind of more more kind of extreme or kind of difficult kind of behaviour. So down here you got kind of calm and able. The more kind of stressed they are, start to feel stressed, they tend to use kind of distraction, excuses, and procrastination. Kind of again can go into kind of physical incapacitation or withdrawal. Can either kind of take control or kind of just kind of go along with what the person's put into them and kind of go into full on kind of panic. So can use either full on shutdown, run away, threats of violence, actual violence towards themselves or other people. This is not linear. People can skip kind of levels, go kind of straight towards it. So yeah, it's taken from the PDA site. It's kind of what is PDA kind of booklet. I do have issues with this diagram, but I don't want to go into that now. It's just it has some use. So yeah, what does demand disorder? What does demand avoidance disorder needs to meet the kind of meet definition for disorder? So rapid mood changes in impulsivity help to indicate issues with kind of behaviour and emotional regulation. Significance of demand avoidance impedes functioning in one area, often multiple ones. It challenges culture norms. So especially in children are meant to kind of do as they're told, and especially women are meant to kind of be more kind of docile and so if you're kind of showing these kind of extreme or kind of difficult kind of behaviours, you kind of transgressing cultural norms. So yeah, using these 5 anxiety-based, restrictive, and principal behaviour interests traits should be sufficient for a demand avoidance-based disorder to meet the definition for a disorder as shown by the DSM-5. It's quite important, is because demand avoidance is itself intrinsically impedes an area of functioning. So it and this is also quite important because this often these features tend to be shown when the person is stressed, mainly stress or high distress. So the social demands for just indicate the significant amount of impairment and distress associated with demand avoidance disorder. So yeah, we're kind of quite lucky that while demand avoidance disorder is a process, it also can be viewed as a distinct thing and therefore a distinct disorder. So kind of coming into kind of models which can be used as part of the formulation process to describe how demand avoidance features kind of defense maintained throughout lifespan. So you have a demand which can be either internal or external, which kind of triggers anxiety, distress, which causes the person to kind of express some kind of avoidance behavior, which can be either rational or irrational in nature, and they get some kind of temporary relief from the anxiety, distress, and therefore the process is kind of this is a negative reinforcement cycle, which is quite generic and quite common throughout mental health literature and other kind of categories or difficulties. So what we have here is a 3-dimensional stress-based model for features associated with demand avoidance, especially seen in PDA. So what we have down here is intensity of the stress features kind of displayed. So what we're talking about here is literally this diagram here. So this diagram is literally the kind of the bottom y-axis going down here. This would be the x-axis. So this is basically telling us how stressed a person is. So what I've got here is, so down here, the more stressed a person is, the more kind of compulsive the actual social avoidance features for here. And what the down here, the less stressed they are. So the less stressed they are, the social avoidance features should be kind of either manipulative or strategic. And I've kind of changed the wording here because I used to have it as being manipulative and then strategic down here. But I realised that if something's strategic, it also has intent. So that's kind of important, because if something's done as part of a plan, so as part of a strategy, it's part of a plan. It means there's a conscious choice has been made to do that behaviour, which means it's equivalent to manipulative. So manipulative is done with intent, and that's not what fits into it. So the more when someone is highly, the more stressed a person is, the less clear thinking they are. They'll tend to process information less quickly and kind of more emotively, and less efficiently. So they're less likely to be they're less likely to be doing things intentionally. The more stressed they are. So I kind of treat it kind of more compulsive down here. So this is literally what the z-axis is the frequency of which the demand of which is split up. So this is literally just how often they are within a given time period. So this could be within a day, a week, a month, or a year. Could be over 32 seconds potentially. It's completely arbitrary depending on which one you want to use, but this is important. So this is the phrase I've been using for the threshold for when the features are literally pathologized as part of the disorder. So yeah, this is just the phrase that was taken from the DSM-5. So it's literally disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in either social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. So this, what I've done here is I've taken the demand management cycle and just turned it into a developmental model. So you have kind of pathological demand avoidance as a form of neurodiversity here, and this is kind of going on to adverse situations or missed developmental opportunities. So you notice these interactions go back and forth and have really wonderful kind of combinations. The point is that they all interact with each other and they all kind of contribute towards kind of how they kind of maintain. So you've got the 5 core anxiety-based restrictive repetitive behavior interest traits here on the right hand side. They can lead into missed opportunities and kind of how the kind of PDA presents. So you've got kind of delayed development, social communication, functional skills, kind of depression, trauma can be present, and kind of lead to kind of anxiety, distress, and yeah. I'm not going to talk about how it kind of works. It should be straightforward for people to kind of use and follow, but just to briefly give an example. So if people have rapid mood changes, that can lead to aversive experiences and missed development opportunities, because if a person has rapid mood changes, you're less likely to interact with them, because it'd be quite to give an example. So from PDA literature, so it's noted that people can go from kind of telling you love them to kind of being violent towards them, or kind of being violent towards them, then kind of telling them that you kind of love them and you're kind of hugging them and telling them you care about them. It can be quite anxiety inducing in other people to be around such kind of unpredictable people. So what that means is that these kind of behaviours can lead to people kind of missing kind of opportunities, and you need to when you miss these opportunities, they can lead to kind of delayed kind of social skills, and they can also lead to kind of trauma and depression, and that can lead to anxiety and stress, which kind of leads people to kind of missing more opportunities. And it's just it's quite important to kind of have this developmental model. So again, this kind of allows as part of the formation process, it allows kind of clinicians to describe how features can be developed, maintained, and it kind of can give some kind of calls and mechanisms as well, potentially, if a person's kind of traumatized, and can lead to miss kind of can have aversive experiences, or lead to experiencing situations to be aversive in nature, partly due to the experience of anxiety being present. But we'll kind of move on. So there are a good number of studies that indicate PDA is seen outside of autism. Some people disagree with some of these, but it's about 10 or so here. There's some studies which indicate PDA, which probably have non-autistic people in. We just don't know due to the nature of studies used. So, for example, the good reason suggests that Trundle case study is non-autistic, but they've not assessed a person with autism, so we can't be definitive there. And there's a good number of topic experts on PDA which say that PDA is seen in non-autistic people. So moving on. So, as I said earlier, PDA presents continuing throughout the human population, is fluid and transient over lifespan and in diverse situations. So, what I mean by that is that where a person is on this diagram changes over lifespan and different situations. So, I'll talk about more about this diagram later, but so I mentioned this quote before. I'm not going to mention it again, but if you apply this quote to the period literature, it's when a person starts to display avoidant behaviour or transient behaviour in response to a particular stressor. So in this particular quote, it's in relation towards autistic children, either typically when they experiencing demand at school or kind of transitioning from kind of primary to secondary, or around the EDQ threshold, or when demand avoidance becomes kind of problematic in nature. I don't like that term, that descriptor kind of problematic demand avoidance, because it's horrifically subjective, but I, as hell, have used it. But moving on, so back to this diagram. So what we got here is on the y-axis is the frequency intensity of which demand avoidances are kind of shown at, and then this is kind of the x-axis is the number of people, so that's basically prevalence. The prevalence rate is proportional of the human population that the demand avoidance is kind of shown at. So the right-hand side, you've got kind of diagnostic thresholds, and it's kind of shaded red. So darker red is the kind of more intense and more frequent features are shown at, and but it's also the cone kind of shows that the features become seen in less people the more intense, more frequent are shown at. So this threshold is when the features are seen to be developmental and kind of pervasive nature. This is when the kind of demand avoidance features are only seen in autistic people. This is when they're only pervasive, and by that I mean it's kind of shown in 3 or more kind of settings, and this is when it's kind of seen in only 2 or more, and this is only seen in 1 or more. So what I've done is I've basically taken all the way back this table. I've taken these diagnostic thresholds and just applied them to this diagram. And some of you might be familiar with this diagram because or aspects of this diagram, because I've literally just modified this diagram here. So I've taken diagnostic thresholds that have been used for PDA in the PDA literature and mapped them on this diagram. And this is my interpretation. Others might need these diagnostic thresholds differently. And there's no fixed way of there's no numbers attached to them, so it's all kind of relative. We should be kind of clear about it. So you see that Eaton Weaver really corresponds to the developmental kind of pervasive, and Wing et al. To only autistic people. Neeson et al. Has got non-autistic people in, so just pervasive and has that. And I've used that one to be the EDAQ or the OCD one. So I've moved one up to have 2 more settings, which is equivalent to an ADHD. So yeah, you should see how these diagrams kind of relate, and I've kind of equated them to kind of diagnostic practice with the DSM-5 and within the PDA literature. So this diagram kind of shows how you can model PDA with internalising and externalising. So internalising kind of features are kind of shown internal to the person, and external, so they kind of express kind of externally kind of behaviour, so it be easier noticed by other people. So this is mainly for kind of like kind of the role play potential. This is for the kind of more active stuff, so like the excuse is kind of like physically incapacitating yourself, so basically like grabbing hold of people's legs, or kind of just going into ball, or the kind of the threats of violence and kind of bring away kind of stuff. So you've got subclinical kind of demand avoidance here, and I've kind of gotten kind of mild PDA is kind of when the feature's seen in one setting, kind of moderate is kind of 2 or more, 2, and kind of severe is when it's pervasive when it's kind of 3 or more settings. So yeah, I've obviously kind of put shaded it so kind of more severe over here. So for the external top right, more severe kind of internalizer features top left. And this is a slightly different variation from previous diagram, because I've kind of pulled the numbers out from the y-axis, so they can be more clearly seen. So that's basically moving up. That's basically it. So some of you will probably notice that I've basically just presented my previous work as how demand avoidance disorder kind of meets the DSM-5's definition. Well, for how one should construct a disorder. Because it's like, Richard, you just restated your work, how you describe and model PDA, and I would go, well, yeah, I just have done. And that's because I'm basically modeling PDA how one should model it if you want it to be a disorder is based on information based on DSM-5. So yeah, so what I'm basically trying to point out is that how I model and describe PDA, there's good reasons for it, and it's how it should be done if you want it to be a standalone thing, basically. I'm going to conclude this. So, yeah, we know how PDA should present as a distinct disorder. This knowledge can be used to inform how one conceptualizes PDA, and obviously design studies and interpretation of results. And this is kind of important because some people are kind of suggesting that there's a clear difference between kind of PDA and kind of other forms of demand avoidance. I would argue that's just nonsense, and the results are probably due to confirmation bias by the people doing those studies. But yeah, and it is important because some recent research results are indicating that PDA is not a distinct thing, and this is kind of empirical evidence. So yeah, demand avoidance should be transactional with a person's environment, so they can be either external and or internal. The PDA features are a process from a broad heterogeneous continuum kind of common to human population. The demand avoidance features and the kind of construct can be pervasive and or developmental nature, but neither is intrinsically the case, so it doesn't have to be pervasive or developmental in nature. And also that that kind of that PDA should present slightly differently in autistic people versus non-autistic people, but it's still only one demand avoidance disorder. So that basically there's only one PDA. So there's not, just because PDA probably presents differently in autistic people compared to non-autistic people, it does not mean that PDA, the version that's seen in autistic people, is a distinct autism profile or distinct subgroup or disorder of autism. That's not the case because we don't have, for example, Greenetail 2018 give reasons for how anxiety is often presents differently. Well, has different cause mechanisms in autistic people compared to non-autistic people. But when you have generic anxiety-based disorders, we don't have special anxiety, like general. We don't have a specialized general anxiety disorder for autistic people. But we only have GAD. We only have general anxiety disorder. So, these are my contact details if you want to get hold of them. So my email address, handle research-gate-link, which has most of my academic portfolio on. And these are the references, so these are the last few slides, and I'm not going to linger over them for more than several seconds each. So, yeah, thank you for watching this video. It was longer than I originally anticipated. Originally hoping to be a short 15-minute one, and it just snowballed longer with realising what information you need to include in it. So, yeah, so thank you for your time, and I hope you come back to watch more of my talk and stuff. So thank you, and that's it. Bye.